So I come over here and stand at this podium because my first job in the government was the spokesman of the State Department. And I used to stand at a podium like this, and there were journalists in front of me, and they would ask me the most difficult questions, and I would try not to answer them. And today, I'm in a position to answer them. And so when we get to the question phase, I hope you will pose some hard ones, because I promise to do my best to address them. I think the first thing to say about the current era with Donald Trump as President of the United States and so much change happening here in Europe, whether that's Brexit or the elections that are coming up in France and Germany, is that it's very, very difficult to predict the political future. That most of the people that I know and respect thought that the Brexit vote was going to go the other way. Most of the people that I know and respect thought that Donald Trump was not going to be elected President of the United States. That's not to say that the news is all wrong and the polls are all wrong. In fact, if you look back at the pre-election polls in the United States and you look at the results, they were actually pretty much, as you would say, spot on, in the sense that 49-47 was the rough popular total for Mrs. Clinton and Donald Trump. Unfortunately for her and me and perhaps the Western world, those votes were located in places that gave Donald Trump the electoral victory. But the polls were more or less accurate. What people have not been able to do, and that's why I think it's so difficult to predict what's going on, is to get a good feel for why it is that Donald Trump has been able to break every rule in politics, has been able to behave in a personal sense in ways that previously would have disqualified or caused the end of campaigns for any other politician. And I think, as many have said, each week of the Trump campaign, we were expecting the new statement, the new outrage, the new step beyond the pale to be the end, and it wasn't. And that's what I think is the real challenge for all of us, is to realize that in some fundamental way, the ground underneath us in terms of politics, expectations, in terms of attitudes, certainly in the United States, and I think increasingly here in Europe, are changed and very, very difficult to predict. Pollster, no pollster, good questions, no questions. It's just very hard to have been able to expect that a voter would, a Republican voter who spent many, many years talking about the dignity of the Oval Office and criticizing the Clintons for what they did or didn't do, to vote for Donald Trump, given all that we knew about him even then. So it's a tough time for predictions. It's a tough time for globalization, as they say. I hate that word now because it's been misunderstood and misrepresented. To me, globalization is two things. It's modernization, and then it's trade policy. And when you separate those two things, they're very, very different. Modernization is not really something, I'm just going to grab some water here, something that the governments did. Governments often took credit for the economic success that occurred during that period, but they didn't really do anything. Globalization, as you came to know it, involved containerization, involved the communications revolution and all of that, and governments really didn't have anything to do with it. But when the economy was doing well, and the modernization component was seen as crucial, then governments took credit for it. So they grabbed some of the credit, and I think unfairly grabbed credit, but just as unfairly are now the governments of the last 15, 20 years getting blamed for modernization, which is not something that governments control. The reason why there's certain parts of our country here in the UK and in the United States don't have jobs is not because of government policy. It's because of the rise of new technologies and the fact that both of our economies are open enough to allow those technologies to grow into businesses. That's the reason why there are not good jobs in certain parts of our country, not the policies of governments. Where the policies of government come in is the second part and the free trade part, and we can get to that in a minute. But that's not the same thing. Those are specific trade policies that you're either for or against, but they're different than modernization. The larger point that I'd like to make to you is that as an American who has been proud of America's role in the world and believes that America can play a constructive role and that America really is required to lead the Western world, and if without that leadership, very little happens. And unfortunately, prior to Donald Trump, there had been this incredible pendulum of American leadership that has damaged the United States, damaged the West, and damaged all of us, I think. And that is that under George Bush, there was an overreach, a belief that we could reach over 10,000 miles into the Middle East, overthrow a government, impose democracy, and then come back. And that was an overreach, and I don't need to bore you with the details of that. I doubt there's anybody in this room who disputes the idea that having invaded Iraq and overthrown the government, that 10 years later, more than 10 years later, we're still fighting in a sense, and the place is still not stable, and it obviously wasn't worth the trouble and the effort and the pain and the loss. Nevertheless, that overreach caused, I think, a backlash in the United States to a point where I would argue, underreach, where under President Obama, the reluctance to involve the United States in the world was so extreme that almost any action by the United States, other than in the area of counterterrorism, the president tried at all costs to avoid. And that's why, the Ukraine response by the West was so, I would argue, mild. That's why it was so difficult for the United States to play a role in Libya in the end, or in Syria at all. And I think the results of those underreach are in, and it was a disaster. Just think of, I ask you to just do one simple thought experiment. Imagine in your head that there had been no refugee crisis in Europe in the summer before the Brexit vote, and the summer for that a bit too, but mostly the summer before the vote. Imagine that had not existed. I think it's highly unlikely that the Brexit vote would have gone the same way. Without refugees, the risk of immigrants coming from the Middle East and Africa, very, very frontal in voters' minds. And that was because the West refused to get involved in a war that turned out to have caused the worst refugee crisis that anybody can remember. It's hard to say the worst. Everybody says the worst this, the worst that. But you got to imagine half of the country, Syria, which was a pretty modern Arab country, half of the country, 1 out of 2 people, was made into a refugee or a displaced person. In other words, it was like a World War II level, Stalingrad level destruction in much of the country, with all of half the people moving. That caused a cascade throughout the Middle East and put refugees on the shores in Europe, and I would argue multiplied by many, many times the fears about and anger and concern about immigrants. So that's what happens when American presidents underreach, that problems that require the West to act if you want to avoid the crisis. Now, some people would say it's none of our business, and that's why the president was right to avoid the problem in Syria. I would say that, yes, it may not be our direct business, but we have to weigh the costs of action, whatever it is we wanted to do, whether it was simple arming and training or a no-fly zone or more, versus the costs of inaction. And I think the jury is in on the costs of inaction. Be hard to exaggerate. 400,000 or 500,000 dead people, mostly by the Syrian government. As I said, tens of millions of people moving around, and refugee levels we've never seen before. I would argue again that Brexit was a subsequent event as a result of that, whether you're for it or against it. It was a consequence. And frankly, the fact that Russia moved in and took the place of the United States as the outside power of significance in the Middle East. Those are the consequences of inaction. And I think the cost was too high. So that's underreach. So what I think, and many people in the United States and in Europe were sort of hoping for is not overreach, not underreach, something in the middle. Let's just reach the appropriate level. Let's work together with our friends and allies. Let's do what's necessary. Let's not look for trouble, but let's consider the costs of inaction when we decide what to do. And instead, we got Mr. Trump. And that wasn't the plan. And I think whatever damage that 16 years of careening from one extreme to the other did to America's leadership in the world, and I think it did a lot of damage, either from those who thought America did too much under Bush or those who thought America did too little under Obama. Donald Trump is going to, if you think of this as a pendulum of Bush and Obama, he took the pendulum and he threw it off the machine and sent it into the next field. There's just no way of gauging what will happen under Mr. Trump in the traditional metrics of American foreign policy. Now, the good news is that some of the things he said haven't really turned out to be policy, and looks like they never will. That is things like it would be okay if Japan were to develop a nuclear weapon. He made that clear. He said he thought there was no particular risk from that, had some advantages. That looks like it's not going to happen. He, in the weeks after being elected, tried to, I guess the fair word would be intimidate China. That is, China, Beijing, China, tried to intimidate this rising power of 1 billion plus people with soon the world's largest economy. He thought he could play the New York real estate games that he used to play of calling up the other side and taking away a position that everyone had previously accepted. So in China's case, he thought he could say that he was going to revisit the question of whether China or Taiwan was really the real China. And he thought that would give him some extra leverage because he thought this was the real estate business in New York. But it isn't. It's the real world. And China is a great power and a rising power and has extraordinary influence in the world. And so what the Chinese did is say, well, we're not interested in talking to Mr. Trump unless and until he returns to the policies of 40 plus years of American presidents, the ones begun in the 70s under Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon. And if he's not prepared to make that commitment in advance, we have nothing to say at the presidential level to the United States. I'm exaggerating a bit and simplifying a bit, but that's exactly more or less what China did. And sure enough, within about 7-8 days, the U.S. government signaled to the Chinese that, yes, the one China policy is still in place, and the phone call happened, and it was, perfectly fine. But that's what happens when an amateur who has great confidence in his own negotiating skills gets into the real world with a country like China. So, excuse me, I don't think that policy is going to change. And the same goes for NATO in the end. During the campaign and in the days and weeks after he was elected, the president said a lot of things that, if you believed in NATO, could really be quite troubling, suggesting that the United States was not going to follow through with its treaty obligations to come to the defense of a fellow ally. And in the foreign policy business, that's about the worst thing you can do to your friend, is say that we're not going to follow through on our 50 years worth of 60, 70 years of a treaty with you. We're just going to see what happens. We'll tell you at the time. That's not the point of NATO. That's not the reason why NATO has been the most powerful and successful alliance in history. And the suggestion was, again, that he was going to use these words as leverage, that he was going to be a great negotiator, the art of the deal. You've heard everyone talk about it, that this was going to get countries to do something they wouldn't otherwise do in terms of money. Now, if you listen to Mr. Trump, he would tell you that it already worked, so he got rid of it, that the other countries have already decided to pay more, and the money's flooding in. I think he said in the State of the Union address, or the address to Congress, he actually said that money's been pouring in from NATO countries. well, the truth is the money doesn't come to the United States. There's no money that goes to a central budget. The question just is what each country spends on defense. And prior to Mr. Trump's inauguration and even his campaign, various countries were heading in the greater direction closer to 2% of GNP per year, GDP per year, because look out there, the world is getting more threatening. If you're Germany, your view of today, Russia looking to the east, is very, very different than it was 5, 10, 15 years ago when the Cold War ended. And defense money is something that doesn't happen quickly, it grows slowly, and so Germany, other countries for the last couple of years have been slowly increasing their defense budget. Is it okay that Mr. Trump encouraged that further? Sure, but not at the risk of casting doubt about the credibility of the United States of America, because there is no coin of the realm more important than that. It is America's treaty alliances, its defense relationships, its promises and pledges to dozens of countries around the world that has helped keep our world safer than it would otherwise be, in Europe and Asia in particular, but elsewhere as well. And so that coin, that pledge of the United States of America, I think is very, very valuable. And one doesn't want to cast doubt on it unless you're absolutely need to, or it's absolutely necessary, and it certainly wasn't in this case. But again, NATO is now back into the category of status quo, same as before. We have secretaries of state and defense who are pretty pro-NATO, and everything should be fine there. And in an odd way, and I'll get to this in a minute, I think Russia policy, believe it or not, is going to end up in the category of status quo. And I will discuss that in a moment, or we can talk about it more in questions. It's a subject that comes up a lot in the context of the new president. The two areas where I think it will change are the international trade policies of the United States and the question of how we go about conducting our counterterrorism policy. Let me start with counterterrorism. Under Bush and Obama, we basically tried to minimize the insult we did to the Islamic world in battling terrorist groups, all of whom were Muslims. So it was tricky. You had to figure out how to go after the Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, all the other groups. All of the people in those groups are Islamic, citizens, religious of Islamic faith. But you wanted to go after them without alienating the other tens of millions of people in the world who are Muslim, whose help you need. Because it's very hard to find people, small groups of people in small places hidden around the world, if their parents, their relatives, their friends, or their neighborhoods did not provide you with information. Frankly, if you don't get information, you will never find these people. It's just too hard, even with all the technology we have in the world. So that was the balance we had to walk. How do you, be candid and honest about the fact that everyone is Islamic, that they use the Quran to justify their mass murder, but that this isn't some fundamental part of the Islamic religion. Well, Mr. Trump doesn't have a problem with that, and the people around him are much more comfortable with suggesting, implying, or some days even stating that there's something wrong with Islam, and that's why these people are all who commit the mass murder, who are part of Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. That's why they're all Muslims. It's not an accident. And obviously that's a very tricky subject. One has to talk about it very intelligently, carefully, and you need a lot of words to explain it if you're going to do it right. It doesn't lend itself to sound bites and short sentences, but nevertheless, that is a difference between President Trump and his predecessors, and frankly, every other government in the world. Even Mr. Putin himself is very, very careful to distinguish between Islam, the religion, and terrorism, and who's conducting it. And the second is free trade and fair trade. everybody says the same thing about trade. Everybody says they're for fair trade. And then they argue about what that means. And I think there's a couple of points to be made here. Number one, it seems to me that the era of multilateral trade agreements was slowly coming to an end anyway. Yes, the Trans-Pacific Partnership would have been, from an American perspective, I think, a very important thing to do, but mostly because of America's geostrategic interest in Asia and the desire to make sure that it was the United States, not China, that made the rules of the game, not because the net benefits for the trade balance were so great, because I don't think they were. Of course, you couldn't know because it was a trade agreement for the future. But I think we've discovered, certainly in the case of NAFTA in the United States, with Mexico and Canada, that the proponents tend to exaggerate the benefits and the opponents tend to exaggerate the downside. But clearly, free trade is the part of the modern world that has taken a bad rap. And it all started, I think, a bad rap. It all started with the sort of anti-free trade protesters that were interfering with summits back in as far back as the Clinton administration that I served in. And by now, I think it's fair to say that the support for free trade in the United States, which used to be orthodoxy in the Republican Party, is gone and will never come back, at least not in the foreseeable future. And in the Democratic Party, it was always weak. It was always a struggle for President Clinton, who's the last Democrat who succeeded in the area of free trade, to get support from the Democrats for a new free trade agreement. It was during his administration, remember, that we brought China into the World Trade Organization, that NAFTA was approved, and the whole world trading system really was locked in. So for a Democrat. So I think that era is gone. And now we're going to find out about whether these bilateral trade agreements are as easy and great as everybody says they are. And I know that people in this room and in this country will be particularly interested to see if that's true. And I think that without getting into too much detail, because it's not my field, the sense I get from the experts is that free trade had reached the end of the line in terms of goods, and now it was about services, and that was a much different area and didn't lend itself as well to these sort of multilateral agreements. Anyway, that for me is a rough summary of what's changed, what stayed the same about the Trump administration. Let me say a word about Russia, and then hopefully I'll have left a few minutes for questions. Look, I don't know what happened between the Trump administration and the Trump himself and the people around him and the Russians. I'm not in the intelligence community, and I doubt they know for sure. What we know is that, because Mr. Putin has said it clearly, is that Mr. Putin preferred Trump to Clinton because Trump wanted to forget about all the problems that have occurred in the last 10 years and go forward and try to make an agreement, and that Trump didn't care about human rights and democracy, so he wasn't going to irritate Vladimir Putin with all those concerns, and that he was prepared to put aside Ukraine and Crimea. And so obviously, Mr. Putin would have preferred him to be president. And from a policy standpoint, that's clear. And so Trump won, and the Russians should be happy, and then I'll end here. But the reality is that after all the noise and all the investigations and all the scandal, it's going to be impossible for Donald Trump to do anything much different than any other president, because any time he even begins to talk about Russia, the noise will get so loud, it will be easier to go back to the status quo. And so in the end, Russia will end up as a status quo policy. But let me stop there and try to take some of your questions. Thank you.